Hi again then guys, and welcome to another Rivals match on Gran Turismo Sport, and this time we're taking a bit of a step back from the world of race cars or prototypes or supercars, and not even Vision GT concepts either. We're taking it much lower, down to the say N200 and N300 classes, to take a look at some of the most significant new hot hatches of the Gran Turismo franchise. Some of these cars, in particular I would say the Citroen, the DS3, is a car which we should have had a long time ago on Gran Turismo 6. It's an obvious choice to add to the Citroen lineup, but for whatever reasons we haven't had it until now. So that's nice. It's nice to allow Citroen to have more flair to the lineup rather than just having the C3s and C4s, which aren't bad, but they're not exactly hot in a traditional sense, whereas this one is a legitimate hot hatch. With that being said, it's interesting to see not only how these three French hatches compare to each other, the Renault, the Peugeot, the Citroen, but also to Gran Turismo's past, because we've talked about hot hatches quite a lot in Rivals. We've talked about old school homologated rally cars like the Delta, we've talked about the early 2000s with your Focus RSs and your Golf R32s, and even the newest ones that Gran Turismo 6 had to offer, like your Meganes and your Focus STs. Now we're taking it to an even newer generation, but with a smaller category. These aren't the size of a Megane or a Focus or a Golf, but they are still very thumpy, fun little cars. So, as always, we'll break down each individual car in its own mini review, talking about its best points and perhaps some points which maybe aren't as good, and then we'll compare the specs of all three, as we usually do in a top trump style matchup, to find out which one wins purely for the fun of it, and of course very subjectively to the system, on paper. First of all then, let's take a look at the Renault Clio. Well, the Clio actually surprised me the most of the three cars, but unfortunately in not a great way. Because to show my cards a little bit, I was expecting this to be the best car of the three. I wasn't necessarily hoping that it would be, I was just expecting it to be. Because let's face it, Peugeot and Citroen have both made great hot hatches in the past. But they haven't really made cars like that for a long time. They've had cars which are technically VTSs and GTIs, but most of them aren't really that hot. They're just a boring hatchback with a bit more power and a wing. That's not exactly what we want from a hot hatch, and although they have their fans, they definitely don't have as many fans as if they were genuinely as hot as the cars that used to be made by those companies, cars which are still loved, like your Peugeot 205 GTIs or T16s, or for Citroen, stuff like the Saxo VTS and VTR, which is now known as a boy racer's car, but is still a great, small, rally-ready hot hatch. Now though, with the Renault has never really stopped making hot hatches. As far back as the Renault 5, right the way up to today with the Twingos, Meganes, Clios, they've always had genuine hot versions, with a lot of power, great performance, and sometimes, such as in the case of the Megane R26R, lap records, significant ones. So I expected this car to have that big advantage going into this match, but the weird thing is, it was the exact opposite. In fact, I would say it was the worst of the three for handling. It really struggles to have the increased power and torque compared to the other two. The other two cars felt to some degree like they took the extra power and torque in their stride, whereas with the Renault, it feels like it was so specifically designed to have the power that it's given, that it really struggles once you take it out of its comfort zone. Almost like a very well-engineered watch. If you try to tinker with the watch, you're not really going to make it any better. You're just going to stop it from working in the narrow zone where it was designed to be. There are certain cars that feel like that, and I would say, to some degree at least, the Clio definitely does. It's not a bad car, but, spoiler alert, it was the slowest of the three, and I was not expecting that. Of course, depending on the tuner, the track, the driver, of course, but for me, I found it to be the slowest. And I certainly didn't want that to be the case, so it's not like the match is rigged. But then that raises the question of how do the others compare? Well, let's consider the Peugeot. Well, as I said, the Renault surprised me the most in a negative way. With the Peugeot, it was the polar opposite. This is the car of the three which surprised me the most in the positive way, I'm very glad to say, because I don't expect very much when I go into driving a Peugeot hatchback these days. Back in the day, they were a force to be reckoned with. The 106 rallies, the 205 T16s, but I just can't take a 207 or a 208 or even something like a 307 or a 206 that seriously. As I said earlier, they feel like technically hot hatches, but nowhere near as hot as they deserve to be, especially given the company's lineage. This one doesn't exactly have the imagery of a hot hatch down that well for me. You can make it look a bit hotter, as I have with red paint and white wheels and that kind of stuff, but it just doesn't look that hot. It looks like another 208 with a wing, which is kind of what I mentioned earlier. However, putting my thoughts of the visuals to one side, which is of course totally subjective, the performance on this car really impressed me, because for one thing, it's the most powerful of the three. That was a big shock to me. I thought it would be the worst. It's the exact opposite. But even more impressively than that, it's got by far the most torque. This is looking pretty good for the Peugeot, and in fact, when I was driving the car, although it wasn't quite the quickest, it was a lot quicker, especially in comparison to the Renault, than I expected it to be. About a second and a half or thereabouts is a very, very impressive amount of time to be between cars like that. And I would say by far the best thing about the Peugeot is that even though it's roughly the same size and even roughly the same weight as the other two, give or take of course, it feels smaller, lighter, more compact and more nimble. And for a hot hatch, especially a small one like a Super Mini, that is a huge advantage to have, because the Clio is literally the exact opposite. It feels big, heavy and bloated, especially tuned. This Peugeot feels like it's in its element. So although I'm not a fan of the style, I've got to take my hat off, really, to Peugeot. You made a great hot hatch, at least in the world of the game, of course, that copes remarkably well with being upgraded. What then about the Citroën, perhaps the most significant of the three cars? Well, you're probably wondering why I would say that the DS3 is the most significant of the three. Well, actually the reason why I would say that is because we already have hot Renaults on Gran Turismo. We even have the predecessor of this car, really, one of the slightly older Clio RSs, and it's one of the most powerful hatchbacks on GT6. So this isn't really anything new, it's just a facelifted version of a similar concept. With the Peugeot, the 208 GTI is fairly similar in concept to the 207 GTI, again, already on GT6. With the DS3 though, that's not the case at all. This is a hatchback which is nothing like the hatchbacks on Gran Turismo 6 from the Citroën dealer. The C3 is a great sleeper car, but it's certainly not a hot hatch in a traditional way, and the C4 is about as hot as a Volvo when it comes to being a hot hatch. And that's nothing against Volvo, they just don't exactly have a reputation for being that kind of car. At least, not until recently with the Polestar versions. This car, though, is a genuine hot hatch for Citroën, and that's significant. I'm happy for the brand to be better represented. So, overall, the DS3 is a car which I would say falls somewhere between the other two. Not in that it feels between good or bad, but that it feels smaller and nimbler than the Clio, but it's a little bit more rabid and a little bit twitchier than the Peugeot. It's not quite as fun as the Peugeot, I would say, but it's definitely an improvement over the Clio. It feels smaller, it feels lighter, and in fact, the Citroën is the lightest of the three, and this did surprise me, as you can see from the lap time, it was the quickest, and that's impressive. So that's it for the individual breakdowns, at least of course from my point of view, but how then do they actually compare on paper once you fully tune them? Well, first of all, as always, we have the price tag, and as I mentioned earlier, these cars are very, very similar in pretty much every way. There's only really a few points here and there that separate them, although in one particular way, which we'll see in a second, there is quite a big margin for one of the cars. As far as price, though, it is the Renault that wins out. All three of them are very affordable, but just by a slight edge, we're going to give the Clio a point there. As far as engine size, well, as I said earlier, we are using, as always, top trump style rules, where biggest is best. Of course, it doesn't work that way in reality, but this is just for the fun of it. So, we'll give the Clio the point. Although even then, it's not the biggest by much, only 20cc of capacity separates all three cars. And in the case of the Peugeot and the Citroën, they're exactly the same. As far as the class of the cars go, in particular the peak class, as I've said before, you don't necessarily need to give any of them a point, because it's a little bit arbitrary, because it's not as exact as the PP system was on Gran Turismo 6, for instance. But still, I am going to give all three cars a point. You could give them none, it really makes no difference either way, so let's do it, just for the sake of it. As far as power though, we do have a clear winner, but once again, all three cars are not that far apart. The Peugeot is the winner with 317 horsepower, but that's just one more, literally 1 horsepower more than the Renault, which in turn is 1 horsepower more than the Citroën. As I said, very, very closely matched. As far as torque though, this is the way that I mentioned earlier that one really does have a big advantage. Surprisingly to me, that's the Peugeot. As you can see from the numbers, it's got a lot more torque, 30 pound-feet more than the Citroën, and even more, 40 pound-feet basically more than the Renault. That's a pretty huge advantage to have. As far as weight though, as I mentioned just now, the Citroën is the lightest, but once again, not much separates them overall. And funnily enough, in a similar way to what I mentioned earlier about the cars feeling different to what they actually are, the car which feels the lightest of the three, I would say, is the Peugeot, which is actually the heaviest of the three, and the car which is second lightest is the Renault, which by far feels the heaviest. It feels easily like an 11 or 1150 kilo car to me. But as far as horsepower per ton, that does mean that with the lowest weight and also the lowest power, but the weight was enough to overcome it, is the Citroën with 307 horsepower per ton, 6 more than the Renault and 10 more than the Peugeot. As far as lap time, well, as always, we don't give that a point because it's way too arbitrary with loads of variables involved, but it is still interesting to note that with me driving, my tuning on this choice of track, the fastest was the Citroën with the 209, then the Peugeot with the 210, and then the Renault with the 212. But overall, that means that in a relatively rare outcome, we have a three-way tie. All three cars have 3 points apiece. So overall, the Renault has the advantage in significantly price, but also to some degree engine size. Then the Peugeot has a pretty nice advantage in the way of both power and torque. And finally, the Citroën in terms of weight and horsepower per ton. And it is definitely interesting to see how the different attributes of the cars allow them to have different advantages. The Renault certainly isn't a bad vehicle, but I would definitely say it was the worst of the three. And although the Citroën was the quickest, and would probably be the obvious choice to go for, I would strongly recommend actually trying out the Peugeot. Because the Peugeot is the most of a sleeper of the three. It's not a car which people expect to be as good as it is. I certainly didn't. But although it wasn't quite as quick as the Citroën, it's just an easier, I would say more fun car to drive. It feels smaller and lighter than it is, and it's just the less obvious choice. So if you're into that, which I certainly am, not using what everyone else uses, because the Peugeot's probably not what everyone's going to use, then you might want to try that one out. But as always, all three are worth a look. Overall then, that's it for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next week with another one, and as always, thanks for watching.